Yat my relatives. This is Mark Charles. It is Tuesday, April 20th, and I'm sitting down to drink my second cup of coffee. I hadn't done this in about a week. I think it was last Tuesday when I had my last second cup of coffee online. So I wanted to sit down today and talk about a few things. There's a lot of things going on. Obviously, the jury in the Derek Chauvin trial is deliberating right now. COVID vaccines are getting dispersed more widely, and there's a lot of things going on. But I wanted to talk about a podcast I heard yesterday from Times the Brief. Times the Brief is the podcast put out by Time Magazine. It's put out multiple times a day on different topics of things that are in the news. And so I want to discuss their podcast yesterday. But before I do, let me start, as I always do, by just acknowledging I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C., and these are the lands of the Piscataway. And I want to thank the Piscataway for the stewardship of these lands. I want to acknowledge them as the host people of these lands. And I want to humbly state how honored I am to be living on these lands today. I can't have my Piscataway relatives. Thank you for being such good stewards of these lands. So just a few things to catch up on. If you've been following me on social media, you know that yesterday I got my first COVID-19 vaccine. I got the Moderna shot here in Washington, D.C. And I had a little bit of a sore arm, but actually not much at all. It was just a little sore. I had it in my right arm because I've had a little bit of tennis elbow, not because I play tennis, but just I stretched my elbow a few weeks ago and it's been a bit sore. So I thought might as well get the shot in my arm that's already sore. So that's why I have my coffee cup here on the left, and I've been drinking with my left for the last several weeks. But anyway, yeah, that was really the only thing I noticed yesterday. And I'm very grateful, as well as very humbled, to have received this vaccine. And I don't say that lightly. I'm very aware that the wealthy countries in the West, specifically the US, Canada, the UK, and others, have literally hoarded the majority of the vaccine supply globally. And we have had very much a America First policy about our vaccine distribution, and again have seemed to have forgotten that we are not in a national epidemic, but we are in a global pandemic. And we not only need to vaccinate ourselves, but we need to make sure that the entire world, especially the poor countries where cases are skyrocketing right now. India, I think, had their highest day infection total of any point in the pandemic yesterday. And there are many other nations that are really struggling right now. And so it was with some humility and maybe even a little bit of shame that I got my vaccine yesterday, knowing that there are literally billions of people around the world in much dire need of it than I am, who are not able to get the vaccine. And I want to encourage our government to do everything possible to make sure that we get vaccine distributed around the globe to the best of our ability. We have an obligation to make sure that those nations that are unable to afford it are able to get their people vaccinated. This is a global pandemic, and this is not a time for America First policies or America First mentality. We have to think globally if we want to really defeat this pandemic. So yeah, it was with a lot of gratitude, as well as with a measure of humility, that I received my vaccination yesterday. And I'll get my next one in 4 weeks. The Moderna is 4 weeks in between. And so I'll let you know how that second shot goes. The other thing I just want to mention briefly is the Derek Chauvin trial that is now in deliberations. And there are they're going in their first full day, their second day total of deliberations. They went in yesterday afternoon. So the earliest we could get a verdict is sometime today. And I'm going to be honest, I'm deeply troubled by this trial. And I'm actually troubled by, I don't even know what to expect from the outcome. Obviously, I want justice. I I want justice for George Floyd's family. I want justice for the African American community. I want justice for people of color throughout this nation. What concerns me is, even if we get a guilty verdict on the most serious of charges in this case, it won't be a systemic fix or a systemic change. It will be a single verdict in a single trial. And so, do I want a conviction? Absolutely. Do I think a conviction will fix the problem? Not even close. And so it really is a challenging time as we go into this. And I don't have a lot of confidence. As you've heard me say before, the Constitution wasn't written to give justice to people of color. That's not why we have a Constitution. It's written to protect white landowning men. And so I don't have a lot of hope going into the outcome of this trial in the first place. But even if it does give the verdict that we are hoping for, and that is absolutely justified in this case, that is not going to fix the problems that we face. And that's the frustration I'm facing. Is, yes, I want this jury to come to this conclusion in this trial, but I also want our nation to deal with our systemic problems, which is why we have these problems in the first place. And this is where I feel so frustrated, because the current administration, Joe Biden, is not going to address things at a foundational level. Yes, he's being much more sympathetic. Yes, he's expressing greater concern than Donald Trump ever did or would have. But he also has been pretty adamant. He's not going to change the foundations. He's not going to address the systemic problem. He may fight for different training. He may fight for a few realignments here, but he's not going after systemic change and not addressing the systemic brokenness, the broken foundations that we have. And that's what feels so frustrating to me right now, is we have an administration that has no interest in addressing this at a foundational level. So I'm watching the case closely, and I do want to encourage that protests are peaceful. I want to encourage that, yes, frustration and actions need to be protested, but I also want to encourage people that we keep our protests peaceful, and I want to encourage police departments, and I want to encourage law enforcement. I want to encourage government agencies that we need to respond peacefully. You need to respond peacefully as well. So we have to look at both sides of the coin here. The next thing I want to talk about, and this is just a little bit more in depth, I'm going to share with you something in the timeline here, or in the chat here. It's a podcast I listened to yesterday. I listened to several news podcasts throughout the day. One of them I listen to not every day, maybe a few times a week, or maybe even a few times every other week. I'll listen to Times The Brief. It's a podcast put out by Time Magazine. It's called The Brief. It comes out multiple times a day. It goes a bit more in depth into a few different stories, and it offers some opinion and some analysis on some things. And yesterday they did one of the Brief's podcast was on reconsidering Abraham Lincoln's legacy. Is all well and good, but you can't argue with results. And they were looking at some of the current ways in which Abraham Lincoln's legacy is being challenged, not only by the school board in San Francisco, but by other groups around the country that are challenging the mythological legacy of Abraham Lincoln. And I heard it come across my podcast, and I almost turned it off. I thought I should listen to it. And so I listened to it yesterday morning, and it does what every single other historical, every single other institution in this country does with Abraham Lincoln. It gives a slight nod to the fact that he said some white supremacist stuff and that he did not act with wholesome intention towards Native communities. But then it just completely steps over the details. And it talks about the Emancipation Proclamation and how Abraham Lincoln fought a civil war, kept the Union together, and freed the nation. And those are the results that they end the podcast with by saying, and you can't argue with those. He freed millions of people from enslavement. Now, they didn't go into the fact that the Emancipation Proclamation does free enslaved people in some states. They didn't mention the fact that the 4 states that were in the North that actually allowed slavery, he didn't free those enslaved in those states. They mentioned the hanging of the Dakota 38 and that he reviewed the cases of the 303 Dakota warriors who were condemned to death and whittled their number down to 38. And this was a benevolent act, apparently, on Abraham Lincoln's part. They didn't go into the fact that just after the hanging, he nullified the treaties, issued a command to remove the Dakota and the Winnebago from Minnesota, and then forcibly remove them from the state altogether. He didn't talk at all about Sand Creek Massacre or about the Long Walk and how he was ethnically cleansing lands to make room for the Transcontinental Railway. They didn't go into that information at all. They didn't actually read his abhorrent quotes in his speeches claiming to be a white supremacist. They didn't read his quote from his first inaugural address or his response to the op-ed that's hanging in the Lincoln Memorial saying he doesn't give a crap about Black lives. They dismissed all these things that are out there. And they said the results you can't argue with are the fact that he fought a civil war, kept the Union together, and freed millions of enslaved people. And yes, he did that. But then they didn't at all talk about the 13th Amendment. Now, he didn't abolish slavery. He redefined and codified it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. And, right, this is Time magazine. They have researchers. They have some pretty bright people working for them. Do some research. Google. Read his speeches. Put into context what was going on. Don't just blindly perpetuate the mythological legacy of this white supremacist and genocidal man because it's too uncomfortable to peel back the layers of what he was actually trying to do. I was very disappointed in Time magazine and in their podcast, The Brief. Not sure if I'm going to respond to them or not yet, but I put the link to the podcast in the chat here, so you can click on it and listen to it. I may try to respond to them at some point in the next few days, at least tweet something at them to give them the fuller context of Abraham Lincoln's story. But anyway, it's just another example, right, of how our nation doesn't have common memory and how mainstream media has no interest in looking in depth at the actual history of our nation and the legacies and the mythologies that we're standing on. So yeah, that was a bit disappointing. Anyway, I wanted to bring that up. There's a lot that's going to be going on this week, and I'm staying on top of it all, watching and listening to the news and understanding what's happening. I will try to address this a bit more, especially once we have a verdict in Derek Chauvin's trial, and we have the results of that. I'm also, one of the reasons I've been a bit more silent, not silent, I've been speaking less in my second cup of coffee these past few weeks is I'm really thinking through my strategy over the next year and a half to 2 years of what are the things that need to be done, what are the things that need to be addressed. And I've been laying fairly low since the election ended in November. I've had a few speaking engagements, most of them pretty small. I had a larger speaking engagement last week, Friday, where I spoke at a conference in New York City. And it was really my first time to speak more comprehensively about some of what I'm thinking moving forward. And the conference was on Imagine a more just society, imagine better democracy, imagine all of these things. And the conference was behind, it was a registration conference, so if you weren't registered for it, you weren't able to see my talk, but I will probably go over my talk at some point in the next week to a week and a half, because it got my mind thinking about what we need to do to move forward and what are the challenges that we're facing. And I began tweeting about some of these things, right? Even just this morning, I tweeted that if you think the only options you have for change in this country are the Democrats or the Republicans, then you're buying into the maintain the status quo paradigm that the white landowning male establishment is peddling, right? So the Republicans forced upon us Donald Trump, a very explicit racist, sexist, and white supremacist man. And then that allowed the Democrats to come and sell Joe Biden as the opposite of that and someone who represents change. When actually he's not change at all. He's the status quo. The two parties are working in conjunction with each other to maintain the status quo. And we need to understand that these are some of the challenges we're facing. And so especially people of color, if we're looking to the two-party system to bring us relief from the dehumanizing institutions, the white supremacist policies of our nation, we're going to be waiting a long time, because that change will only come as the white landowning male establishment that set up that system decides to give up that power. And this is why we have to think outside the two-party system. This is why I ran as an independent in 2020. This is why we have to address how the two-party system is really working to maintain the status quo. And we have, to be honest, have to stop putting our confidence in the two-party system and acknowledge it's not there to bring about change, at least not very quickly, incrementally, in very, very, very tiny baby steps. And we need this change to come quicker. And so we have to begin to think, how do we engage these things outside of that two-party system? So anyway, these are just some thoughts I've been having these past several weeks, and I'm beginning to put some of those together, and I hope to share that a bit more fully with you in the next week or so. But yeah, I just wanted to jump on today and mention a few of these things. There's a lot going on. If you've been watching me on social media, you know I've been watching the sunrise many mornings a week, and it's actually been very restorative to me to go back and pick up this discipline I began back on the reservation of watching the sunrise, remembering, yes, my job is to live responsibly, to walk in beauty with creation as well as with all of our relatives here on this earth. But there's things we can't control, and we need to learn how to acknowledge our own humanity, our own frailty in the midst of all this. And so it's been very restorative for me to go back and watch the sunrise. I've been filming those, putting them online. They're on my YouTube channel, my Facebook, my Instagram, and on Twitter. I welcome you to join me. You can join me live, or you can watch the archive videos up there. But it really is going to be a key component of my messaging moving forward. And I don't say a lot during those sunrise live streams. I don't say much. I usually end with a few words and have a short prayer of gratitude to Creator. But I don't go in depth on anything in those times. But they will be a very key component of whatever messaging we have moving forward. So I invite you to join me with that. But yeah, I hope all of you are doing well. I hope that you're able to protect your health. Please remember, even though vaccinations are increasing, at least in our country, COVID-19 is still out there. And just because you have the vaccine or you've been vaccinated doesn't mean you can't still spread the disease. And so we now need to protect the most vulnerable in our community. And the most vulnerable has been changing. It's no longer our elders, because most of our elders are now vaccinated. The most vulnerable are now our young people, our children, who under the age of 18 cannot be vaccinated yet. And we need to protect their health. So continue to wear masks, continue to social distance, continue to protect your health and the health of the most vulnerable in our globe, in our global community. Hope you have a good day, my relatives. I will hopefully be back on, if not tomorrow, maybe on Thursday. And on Friday, I'm going to be doing a live stream about my book, Unsettling Truths. And if you have any questions about that book that you want to submit to me, I encourage you to, I'll tweet out a link on my website where you can submit questions, and or you can just tweet to me and tag me, and I'll try to grab questions off my Twitter feed as well. But I'd like to take some time this Friday to answer some questions about Unsettling Truths and begin to work through that a bit more methodically. So yeah, I can't have my relatives. I hope you have a great day. Walk in beauty, and may we learn how to walk in beauty together. Hakone.